Hi everyone, and welcome back. And also back by popular demand is Ray McGovern, a former CIA officer for 27 years, who chaired the National Intelligence Estimates and also prepared the President's Daily Brief. So it's good to have you back, Ray. And you've been traveling around Europe, especially Germany, speaking about, well, I guess your concerns and warnings. So I thought a good place to start would be what you have learned from the trip, speaking with yeah, Europeans, because you've been, of course, focused on this continent for many decades, on Russia, well, the Soviet Union and Europe. Uh, what I guess what was the main takeaway? What did you learn about the the sentiments in Europe and perhaps the eagerness for war or preparedness for war? How are you reading the situation at the moment?
Well, the most important thing I learned, Glenn, was to watch my step. Um, the reason for my unsightly appearance here is that I didn't watch my step and I fell down, luckily, on my head because I'm Irish. So I didn't break anything. Uh, and I'm fine to speak, but you'll have to forgive my appearance. So that was the most salient lesson that I learned. In a more serious vein, Elizabeth Murray, one of our veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, who specializes on the Middle East and is fluent in Arabic as well as German and Spanish. And I did this a 2 week tour of Germany. And we appeared in Norway and also in London. It's a very, very different Europe. I mean, my God, at the risk of betraying my age, my first 3 months in Europe was with some college colleagues, three of them, in 1959. And then, fast forward to my specialty on Russia, and then actually I was the National Intelligence Officer for Europe during the 70s before I briefed the President's Daily Brief one-on-one during the Reagan first term. So I know a good bit about Europe, but still I was very unsettled by what I heard in Germany, where the media is worse than the media in the United States, blackening Russia and putting devil's horns on Putin, and not making much sense of how they wish to proceed. It's what I call the coalition of the brain dead. Merz, Stormer, and Macron. I mean, the Russophobia is reeking from the three of them. And I don't know exactly how dumb they are or how contrived they think they are in playing up this Russian menace, because in the final analysis, if they think that they can replace the United States in supporting Ukraine to help it contend with Russia, to help it prevent a utter defeat by Russia, they're dreaming. They are the coalition of the brain dead. So it all doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I thought I knew a good bit about Europe, and I think I still do, but I'm mystified by these so-called, well, I gotta call them leaders, they're hacks that bubble to the political top and are now reigning supreme in these countries. And, with respect to Ukraine, the proof will be in the pudding. In my view, the U.S. is on the way out. They've made it very clear that, okay, Britain, France, and Germany, if you want to take our place, good luck. You can give them weapons, but you have to buy them from us. I mean, hello. I mean, the whole thing is really crazy. So I'll leave it at that. Are there any other things? Well, yeah, there was a bifurcation, for example, in Norway. Uh, on the Middle East, I found the Norwegians quite sensible. I mean, they care about people. They care about genocide. But by the same token, they seem totally brainwashed on Ukraine and the evil Russians. So, how do you figure all that? I think the media is the core of the problem, but it's also a lack of ability by people who have good sense to bubble to the top in these political arrangements, witness the clowns that they have in those three countries I mentioned.
Yeah, no, well, I'm also a bit surprised. There's always been, yeah, a reasonable amount of Russophobia. I remember back in 2014, Henry Kissinger, who wrote in the Washington Post that the demonization of Vladimir Putin is not a policy, it's an alibi for the absence of one. So just we don't have a policy towards the Russians, so everything that's wrong in the relationship is because Putin is a bad man. This is effectively all we have, and it is something striking about the similar situation now. There's never any discussion about any of Russia's grievances, which is really weird at this point in time that they're discussing possible peace. Because when you talk peace, we can only speak about what in a peace agreement the Ukrainians will want. They will want proper deterrence. They need to be able to have their security with their defense system. So, there's endless discussion. But the one who's actually winning the war, you're not allowed to talk about it, because once you discuss what they want in a peace agreement, you have to discuss what might be their security concerns. And in yeah, sitting here in Europe, this is deemed to be treason. If you recognize they have security concern, then you're seen as legitimizing their policies, and you're a traitor. And everyone has to kind of conform to this good versus evil. And it's really as dumbed down and simplistic as this. And it also prevents any diplomacy, because if you dealing with evil, there can be no diplomacy, no negotiations, no mutual understanding, and certainly not peace. And so this Cold War mentality is really, well, I don't think it was like this during the Cold War. Again, I was born in 79, so only got to see the last parts, but nonetheless, there was some more common sense. You were allowed to discuss the security concerns and the arguments of Moscow. You didn't have to censor all the news coming out of Russia. Every journalist from Russia wasn't a propagandist, and anyone who discussed Russian concerns here at home wasn't an agent of Russia. But from the statements of Merz and others, is this just tough language, or do you think they are ready for war? Because it doesn't seem this is a war they can win.
Well, Mertz is the perfect exemplar of some. Can you hear me okay? I'm not.
Oh, I hear it perfectly.
Okay. Is the perfect exemplar of somebody coming out of the military industrial complex, Hello, look where he's come from. So the profiteering on war by Rheinmetall or Kausmafei or all these German firms that are going to try to get into this common European battle tank now, Kausmafei, you build the bottom, and Rheinmetall, you build the top, and we'll not sue each other. We'll just get lots of money. I mean, that's part of it. And of course, the U.S. is going to be profiteering the same way. Um, you know, it's a it's a given that this drives a lot of people, but Mouts is, as I say, the perfect example of this. I would go back a little bit and just show that Obama, for all his faults, and they were many, was at least sensible enough to sense that the U.S. had core interests and that Russia had core interests, and that sometimes they were at loggerheads. Okay, now let me explain. Obama in 2015, well, 10 years ago, okay, he said, look, the Russians have a core interest. They see Ukraine as a potential existential threat. For us, no existential threat from Ukraine and no core interest. So we have to be really careful about what we accept as the core interests and not overreach where they don't really exist. And at the same time, he said, the worst thing we could do for the Ukrainians is to give them the idea that they could prevail over a much more powerful Russia. Okay. And as a codicil to this, there was a deputy secretary of state at the time who said, Mr. President, you are absolutely right, because every weapon that we would give Ukraine could be matched and then doubled and then tripled and then quadrupled by Russia. Now, most people don't remember that, nor do they remember who that Deputy Secretary of State was, but his name was Antony Blinken. So that's what he said under Obama. He comes into under Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, well, he has this Cold War mentality and this feeling of exceptionalism, and of course we can do this. We can give the Ukrainians, we're the strongest. We can give the Ukrainians whatever they need to make Russia weaker. And what does Tony Blinken say? Yes, sir, of course we can. And he and this guy Sullivan sell Biden a bill of goods. That's the background, okay? And that's what the Russians saw. And so in the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw all kinds of things happen that the Russians thought, well, what most people don't know is that according to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in February, the shelling of the primarily Russian-speaking Donbass went up by a factor of 10 and more. Okay, this shelling of civilians. The bulk of the Ukrainian army was massed against the Donbass. It looked like they were going to go in there and clean it out, having been trained to NATO standards and weaponized by NATO for the previous 8 years. That's largely why Putin went into Ukraine. So, you know, what people have been brainwashed to believe, namely that the invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, full scale, illegal. Well, the first two are demonstrably untrue. The second one is unsettled law, and I have that from Peter Falk, the international law, Richard Falk, international law professor. Okay, so let's do unprovoked. Well, I've just done unprovoked. Full scale, right. So the Russians wanted to invade and conquer Ukraine with 90,000 people and 19,000 troops that they massed pretty near Kiev. 90,000? For God's sake. That's full scale? Give me a break. What they wanted to do was scare the pants off Zelensky, which they succeeded in doing. Zelensky appointed his best friend to negotiate with the Russians the day after the invasion started. They negotiated in Belarus, and then they went down to Istanbul and did an agreement. Okay, the agreement said no Ukraine in NATO, and we could just make other deals about protecting Russians in the Donbass. We'll put Crimea off to. In other words, Ukraine can pretty much stay intact, but we want to enforce the improvements in the situation of Russian speakers. So now what happened? Well, the U.S., in the person of Boris Johnson, nixed that. Is that true? Of course it's true. The Ukrainian negotiators, again, Zelensky's best friend, came back and said exactly that. Okay, so let me just finish this little part by saying when people say that the Russians would not, well, President Biden, or you think the Russians are stopping Ukraine? Do you think that? Poland's next, and then the Baltic states. So don't even think the Russians are stopping Ukraine. Well, The fact is, although the media doesn't educate people to this, the fact is the Russians already stopped. They stopped in April 2024, 22, 6 weeks after the invasion. Okay. Why did they stop? Because they had a deal. No Ukraine and NATO and some demilitarization along that line. So, hello, folks. Please be aware the Russians already stopped. They didn't want to take over the Donbass physically, much less the rest of Ukraine, much less Poland, much less the Baltic states. So they already stopped. So what does this mean? This means, number one, that most people don't realize this because inappropriate attention was given to it. It also means that Trump can say, look, um, this isn't my war. Uh, the Russians have legitimate interests here. Trump has himself have said, look, he said this about 2 months ago. Look, I can understand why the Russians wouldn't want NATO in Ukraine or Ukraine in NATO. I can understand why. Yeah, I can. Well, hello. That's most of the riddle solved there. So what I'm saying here is that Trump is in a strong position if he can muster his forces behind him and say, okay, Mr. Putin, we'll make an agreement. You've won militarily, but please help us show enough flexibility that we can put adequate lipstick on this pig of defeat for NATO, for Ukraine, and for the United States. That is possible. Probable, I would say it could be probable because I do see signs, and I'm an outlier on this, an outlier, that Trump and Putin, despite all the betrayals, despite all the trickery that had gone on in the US and the NATO camp, that he still will settle for a settlement that recognizes Russia's core interests, that does not admit Ukraine into NATO, and that provides the kind of cordon sanitaire or buffer zone that will satisfy the Russians that they have a reasonable degree of security without the US or NATO or anyone else trying to threaten them as they have over the past several years.
Yeah, well, the rhetoric has changed a lot because yeah, many of the things you referred to, for example, the European security architecture, it used to be something that Europeans would discuss. The Germans would say that the danger is that we're creating a Europe without the Russians, that it could become a Europe against the Russians. So again, reviving the Cold War logic. Macron in France was making similar arguments that we need to find a place for Russia in this in the European security architecture. All of this is gone. Now is everything is just Putin is a bad man. The Russians are imperialists, uh, and yeah, there's no dissent at all. There's no acceptance for any other arguments. But what I find fascinating, though, is the role of the Germans. Not to pick on the Germans. I think the many of the other Europeans are also quite mad. The Baltic states. I'm in Scandinavia. I get the impression that yeah, we have completely lost our minds here. But uh, well, rational discussions are gone. There's no proper debates anymore. But the Germans really seem to stand out a bit, and this is something that the Russians seemingly have picked up on, who now have replaced America as a great opponent with the Germans. Are the Germans aware of this, and why do you think yeah this shift has happened? Because Germany was really the post World War II miracle child. You know, they learned from history. They were gonna just go with economic growth, always go with diplomacy, avoid militarism. This was kind of the historical lesson they've had, and now, of course, it's a very different Germany.
Yeah, Glenn, I feel very close to this, having been in Germany just recently and also having spent 5 years officially in Germany working for the agency that I worked for. Um, so I thought I knew Germany pretty well. And when I hosted all the visitors who wanted to come to Munich, where I was stationed both in the 60s and in the 70s, I made sure that after visiting the Hofbräu house and all that stuff, that we put Dachau on the itinerary so that they could be reminded that this was also part of Germany, Dachau, the concentration camps, and so forth. So, uh, why is it that the Germans are malnourished on the truth? Well, that's very clearly their subordination to the mainstream media, the corporate media that controls the what comes out of the print and electronic media. But you know, it's really disturbing because on the one hand, you have the most well-educated, talented, well, before the Second World War and after, as you point out, the most cultivated people in the West or among them, uh, just not able to make decisions for themselves. I've been criticizing the Germans for being childish or adolescentish or just not able to act like adults. After World War II, of course, that was understandable. Now, 80 years later, it's hard for me to understand. But I just adduced the example of a German lawyer who was studying to be a judge in Germany in early 1933, watching what went down after the Reichstag was burned, okay, and how repressive uh, measures were brought in, and how people were just brainwashed to accept what happened. And he talked about, he wrote in his diary, his name was Sebastian Hafner, pen name, real name Raimund Pretzel. And for those German people who are German, it's die Geschichte eines Deutschen. In in English, it's Defying Hitler. You ought to read it. It's really interesting. What he points out is that after the Reichstagsbrand, the fire, Hitler had a minority of support, but the Social Democrats caved. And then the Catholic Centrum Party caved. And all of a sudden, Hitler had a majority. And as this young lawyer recorded what he watched, he saw his colleagues, sophisticated lawyers preparing to be judges, just saying, well, what do you care about your desk being raided or your conversations on the phone being overheard? Why do you care about that? It doesn't really matter. And so what he coined was this German phrase, see if I can remember it. Yeah, it was Schaffsmäßige Ergebenheit. Now, it's almost as hard to pronounce in English. Schaf is sheep, okay? So it's Schaffsmäßige sheepish Ergebenheit, submissiveness. Say it 3 times in a row. Sheepish submissiveness. Okay, my God. It sticks in my craw because that's what obtained then, 1933, and in large measure obtains now, except for the fact that this Merz may not be in power very much longer, that there is a whole majority party now, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, that has a lot of votes in the Bundestag, and that there's a real challenge now from people who say, "Look, we want a better relationship with the East, like Willy Brandt, Ostpolitik. We want to have a decent relationship with Russia, and blah blah blah." So what I'm saying is that despite the media in Germany, the strength of this Alternative für Deutschland, mostly in what used to be East Germany, is very very strong and growing. And so, uh, to take a more positive attitude, this sheepish submissiveness is not shared by a growing almost majority of the German people, at least party wise. And it's really debatable how long this will last. The more so since hard reality is going to set in when the Germans and the French and the British say, "Oh my God, we've swallowed too much here. How can we possibly help the Ukrainians? Yeah, we'll spend billions of money on the military-industrial complex. We'll buy weapons from the U.S. But how long can that last when our economies are going boom?" And that's true. Those economies are going real down real fast. And the pricing, ironically, the price of what used to be Russian gas and oil provided to these countries is the main reason why Germany, for example, has become a basket case in terms of industrialization. They are being deindustrialized. I mean, for God's sake, Volkswagen. Volkswagen has put off workers. It shows closed factories, and they're producing tanks now. No more little bugs or even gulps. It's hello. So military-industrial complex once again to circle around is making a lot of bucks. How long the German people will suffer that or abide by that or allow that? Well, the proof is in the pudding. They're going to have to overcome this schaffsmäßige Ergebenheit.
Yeah, I think, well, when you speak to people across Europe, though, a lot of people do recognize that something is off, that it's a bit strange you get this heavy emotional rhetoric shoved down your throat, and there's no debate really, no discussions anymore. And if there is some position, it will be, well, destroyed with personal attacks kind of quick. And I think many people are having difficulties finding language with what is wrong. And I think a good way the political propaganda work is they often appeal to the goodness in people. That is, they say, look at these terrible things, for example, that's happening in Ukraine. Surely you have empathy for this. Look at what's happening to the civilians, and everyone would have empathy. So then, okay, so everyone's on board, and then you take the next step. Then we have to help, and yes, of course, we want to help people who are suffering, and then you have this concept of help, and you can fill this concept with anything you want. So suddenly, escalating tensions with Russia somehow is helping. Shooting missiles into Russian cities helping. So, and anyone who oppose it then are not just contesting the logic or presenting new evidence or perspective. They're going against your virtue because everything now is between those who care and those who are with the enemy effectively. And this is the extent of analysis, and it's quite shocking. There's just no distinction anymore between what you think and your opponent should do versus what you want them to do. So, for example, with when the attacks occurred on Iran, I warned, oh, this is foolish. You know, they will have now. If I was advising Iran now, I would say you need to get nuclear weapons. They're not going to stop. They're going to just seek to destroy you. Uh, they will, yeah, try to make you into a new Syria, make you into a new Libya. They will, Israel, United States, and others will continue. So you should get nuclear weapons. This would be an advice, but it doesn't mean that I would like it. This would be nuclear proliferation in the region. It would be horrible. It would be a terrible precedent. And it's the same with the Ukraine war. If you recognize this as an existential threat for Russia, if you would advise them, you'd say, well, under no circumstance can you let this NATO incrementalism of entrenching itself in Ukraine be acceptable because this will be an existential threat. And the more NATO doubles down. If there is no political settlement possible to restore neutrality, well, what would you advise that the Russians would do? Well, you would have to take the key strategic territories, which you can't afford NATO to get their hands on, and you would want to destroy the infrastructure in the rest of the country so they can't be a useful front line. Again, if
You better stop,
but
Glenn.
yeah,
You're
but
becoming.
but but this is not something I would want. The Ukrainian nation is being destroyed. We're gonna have chaos in Europe for decades to come. It's gonna be fueling distrust and hatred between the Europeans and the Russians. This is a disaster, but you have to be honest about the security concern of your opponents and what is rational policies for them to mitigate this. It doesn't mean that you want these things to happen, but it's impossible to make that distinction in Europe these days. Everything has to be emotions. So all they want to hear is there's a good guy, a bad guy, and anything you say cannot be seen as legitimizing the opponent, which means that there's no analysis left. Everything is just good versus evil, and there can be no understanding for the opponent. Understanding is now immoral because now you're siding with them. It's just beyond ridiculous. And well, once you see the level of discourse, it doesn't really surprise you anymore. Why war is now seemingly the only option we have, and the media is acting only as cheerleaders. But
The key word you just used, Glenn, is understanding. Uh, in German, verstehen is to understand. And I may have mentioned this before, but perhaps it's worth repeating. When I was in Germany about 8 years ago, I saw this little button, put on your thing, and it said Putin Versteher,
yeah.
someone who understands Putin, right? Now, it had Putin there and the words, and I said, my God, Gottes Willen, wow, hope here. So people are trying to persuade, trying to understand Putin. So I grabbed the thing, and my colleague said, no, put that back. I said, why? Oh, that's a pejorative. Putin verstehe. Oh, that means you're in Putin's pocket, for God's sake. So leave that alone. Don't even think of wearing that thing. Well, who but Angela Merkel 2 months ago, when she said, on second thought, maybe the Russians are really worried about us Germans say. Then she was called, guess what, Glenn? A Putin Versteher. and and she took to her credit, she said, no, wait a second. Look, this is really stupid. To understand your enemy is to kind of, help work things out. So, Putin Versteher should not be a pejorative, says Angela Merkel. After betraying Putin 3 or 4 times together with France on how to have a ceasefire, how to have a workable arrangement short of war on Ukraine. So all I'm saying is that now even Angela Merkel is being accused of being a Putin Versteher. It's really, really eigenartig. It's really unique. It's something I've never seen before, but people are closed off against looking at reality. That's why I say that when reality sets in, and the U.S., as I believe is inevitable, will be withdrawing. And I know lots of people say, "I'm McGovern, you're the outlier here." But when Trump says, "Look, Ukraine should have weaponry, and we'll produce it if you buy it from us, France and Germany and England. And yeah, we can do it. We love to produce weapons. Weapons are us. So you buy it from us and then give it to Ukraine. See what happens." I mean, it's when reality sets in. I wouldn't give Merz very long in tenure. Macron has always been like this, and Starmer probably even less tenure because people are hurting. And I was in London, I was able to like walk around just a little bit and see, that people. It's a much shoddier city than I remember before. People are hurting. Uh, the National Health Service that I was the beneficiary of, they took exceptionally good health. That's being privatized, for God's sake. I was lucky before they privatized this particular hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, where I saw no, where I saw no fewer than 7 specialists to make sure I had no broken bones or how could straighten out this. They couldn't straighten this because that was a pre-existing arthritic thing. But all I'm saying is that people are going to have to realize this as a revolutionary moment, and I think the sooner the better. The Stormers, the Marzes, and the Macrons are not long for this world. But in the meantime, the military-industrial complex in these countries, and particularly in the United States, who sell all these weapons, will prosper. And one wonders whether the media will ever catch up with this before there's an actual revolution a la 1848.
Yeah, because I think the long trend is people lose trust in the media, they lose trust in the politicians, and uh, well, we're seeing this now also across Europe. There's a legitimacy crisis across the continent. When you say Starmer, he's not very popular. Merz, Macron, when there's need to overturn elections, such as what was done in Romania, all of this, yeah, the discussion now to cancel the main opposition party in Germany, it's you can only do this for so long before, yeah, the political social system begins to destabilize itself. So there's a lot of self-harm being done at the moment, and I only see doubling down. I don't see any common sense or any discussion around this. But on that topic, on the lack of trust in the political system, it also links with the Russiagate, because this is a lot of revelations which have come out lately. This is something, of course, which is has destroyed a lot of confidence for good reasons in the political class as well as the media and intelligence agencies, for that sake. But we now see that Tulsi Gabbard um, has come out with this new documents, and I wanted to ask you, because this is kind of related to the Russia hatred, which has really gone through through the charts over the past decade. And you were one of the few people who stood up and said from day one that this Russiagate stuff was pure nonsense, that it didn't make any sense. You pointed out everything that was wrong. So, and you've written a lot about it, and suddenly, yeah, I wanted to to get your take on these new revelations, as again, with your almost 3 decades in the CIA. Uh, what do you make of these new revelations and the idea of Obama treason, as Tulsi Gabbard put it?
Well, bottom line, Glenn, is that Russophobia prevails in our country, and it's largely due to this made up Russian hacking and Russian interference in the 2016 election. So I've been following this like a junkyard dog, okay? And I've been in conversation, for example, with many pro-Democratic Party media people. And one of them asked me about 2 years ago, McGovern, why are you so obsessed about Russiagate? Why do you care whether it's true or not, whether the Russians hacked into the Democratic National Committee? And, I had been debating this thing with him for a long time. Finally, I said, I guess it's because Russia has nuclear weapons. And he thought for a second. He says, oh, well, yeah, I suppose. Suffice it to say that this was all made up by Obama in the first instance, his primary advisor, John Brennan, head of the CIA, James Comey, head of the FBI, James Clapper, who was Director of National Intelligence, the national security military generals and admirals that went along with it, and it was made out of whole cloth. There was no Russian hacking. There was no Russian interference in the 2016 election. We know this from the empirical evidence we observe and our expertise in looking at what's going on in Russia-US relations. Now it's been proven. Now the Director of National Intelligence under Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, has released documents documents that document all that went on where the honest people within the CIA, which I'm delighted to find out still exist in the CIA, were saying, look, Mr. Putin has no preference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, for God's sake. No, there's no preference at all. The devil he knows, Hillary Clinton. He doesn't like her, but he says he can work with her. Donald Trump, my God. And what I said at the time is operative here. What a Russian president looks for in an American president is predictability. Okay. I mean, it makes sense. This president has his finger on the codes, the nuclear codes. So what you yearn for is a president that you can talk to, a president who is predictable. Now, Trump was the epitome of unpredictability. Okay? So I always thought from the very beginning that this notion that Putin would prefer Trump to come in, the paragon of unpredictability, was crazy. Okay. But of course, this tale unfolded. Things were made up. The Russian hacking was disproved by official testimony under oath before the House Select Committee on December 5, 2017. Okay. What's that? Almost 8 years ago. What happened? Well, the head of the head of the people that did the forensics said, well, there's no indication of any exfiltration of emails from the DNC. In other words, there was no hack. It had to be a copy. In other words, there was no trace on the internet, no trace in the ether. It was rather a matter of somebody in the DNC or somebody with access to DNC computers put in a little thumb drive and copied, not downloaded, copied it onto a thumb drive. And we were able to prove that from the principles of physics, for God's sake. We knew the capacity of a thumb drive. We knew the speed at which this was downloaded. And we could say, look, this was not a hack. Finally, on the 5th of December, the head of the forensics outfit, an outfit outside the FBI, run by an alumnus of the FBI, testified under oath. There was no Russian hack. Nobody hacked those DNC emails, not Russia, not anybody else. Now, what happened? Adam Schiff came in the next month as head of the House Intelligence Committee, before which this sworn testimony occurred, and he put it in his bottom safe and kept it there for 2.5 years. I kid you not. This testimony that said the Russians didn't hack into the DNC was kept under lock and key. And finally, somebody said to then President Trump, hey, Mr. President, you're the president, you could get that testimony released. He's like, huh? Now just tell Adam Schiff that if he doesn't release it tomorrow, you will. Okay. The next day, Adam Schiff releases it. Okay, now, very damning testimony. It's released with about 56 other memos. And, well, can the mainstream media be forgiven for missing it? No, they can't be forgiven, for God's sake. What happened? Well, it was released by Adam Schiff on May 7th, 2020. What's today? July 25th, 2025. It's still under wraps. The mainstream media has not mentioned the fact that this whole business about the Russian hack of those Democratic National Committee emails, which were so prejudicial to Hillary Clinton, that the Russians had no hand in that, that it wasn't even a hack, it was a thumb drive by somebody with access to those computers. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means everything. That means that the media is still controlling what Americans can think or believe. And the media now is coming out and saying, oh, yeah, Tulsi Gabbard, she says she's got documents. We got other documents, and sowing complete confusion among the American people. It's very, very, well, I wouldn't say frustrating, because we're not supposed to be frustrated or discouraging. That's not allowed. We're not allowed to be discouraged. Uh, it's anger inducing, and anger is a virtue, according to Thomas Aquinas. Just enough anger, the Pythagorean idea of just enough virtue, okay, is a virtue. Okay, so I am virtuously angry about all this stuff, and I'm trying to find a way, Glenn, to find people smarter than I am, because there have to be people who know how to get your program and others into the mainstream media. I know you're having considerable success. I suspect most of that is with the choir, so to speak. But I think that the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Are we not smart enough to find some way to get into the mainstream consciousness so people can not no longer think of Putin and the Russians as bêtes noires, which have to be contended with at every turn? I think we are able to do that, but I haven't found anyone who would be able to kind of be smart enough to get together with PR people, with technical people, with political people, and I mean, it's gotta be possible, Glenn. If I seem a little frustrated, well, I'm not. I'm just angry.
Oh, it makes sense. Well, some of these documents, though, when because the hacking of the election, the Russians stealing this, using it to swing the election in favor of Trump, this was supposed to be this great attack on American democracy, something that had to be avenged, which again had a spillover effect on intensifying the conflict in Ukraine. Well, it turns out from these documents that the uh, yeah, the alleged hack, he had low confidence, it said in this document. And but again, the intelligence agencies then went on, pushed this as being highly reliable, again, against their own documents they were sitting on. And the media, very, very uncritical. And I thought that was a good point you brought up. Where's the media coverage now? Because this was really front and center. It was taking all the headlines. It helped to polarize society. It created restrictions on free speech, because suddenly we had to be defended against this kind of disinformation and how Russia was attacking our democracies. And and of course, we have to pursue possible war with Russia, and now it's proven it's all based on a hoax to try to take down the Trump presidency. So this, where's the accountability? It's a bit shocking not to have any accountability at all. As for the media now, who are pushing this disinformation for years and years, if they don't agree with the documents, publish at least stories, discuss it. What's the counter argument? But ignoring it, it's further complicity, and it's so dangerous, because this is just gonna, yeah, continue to, yeah, undermine trust in the media, which is not trustworthy at the moment. So, but there's no one benefits from this, not to have, trustworthy media.
That's exactly right. Now, the so-called intelligence community assessment that Obama ordered and that was prepared and said, oh, yeah, the Russians hacked and the Russians did all these terrible things to bend the election away from make Hillary lose, and all this stuff. Well, that was prepared not by 17 intelligence agencies, as Hillary Clinton claimed and was allowed to claim for 2 or 3 months before a congressional person asked the National Intelligence Director, James Clapper, about how many agencies really participated in that. And he said, oh, well, actually only 3. Well, I thought it was 17. No, it was real fast. So we need only 3. Who were they? It was the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, National Security Agency, under the tutelage of Mr. Clapper, who was the National Intelligence Director. So Obama asked us to do that. So was it 3 intelligence agencies? Well, now we know from documents that it was only 5 handpicked analysts from the CIA, FBI, NSA. They weren't involved in drafting this thing. John Brennan of the CIA directed what the result would be. It was counterintuitive to the good analysts who knew that Russia had no preference. But this is a typical technique. You assemble a bunch of people who will write what you want them to write and get cash awards for it. You put them off to the side and you have them prepare what's necessary, so to speak, okay? Now, one of those fellows I had, oh, yeah, it's got a picture here. Just as recently as last year, this fellow named Michael Van Landenham, here's his picture, okay? He bragged in a magazine how he confirmed that Russia meddled in 1916 to help. And who is he? He was a neophyte analyst from some other agency that was collected by John Brennan. You put these people in place and you run with them. This happened before when I was still working in the CIA. Director Bill Casey wanted to prove that the Russians were behind the assassination attempt on the Pope. And so he tasked us analysts to come up with that story. And we said, no, they weren't behind it. There's no evidence they were behind it. So what did he do? He created 5 other analysts, set them up in a separate directorate and said, now, you find the right answer. And guess what they found? The Russians and the Bulgarians were certainly responsible for trying to kill a pope. That's what the Russians are like. So it's a time-worn technique. You get these people, and we didn't realize there were only 5, but there were 5. They were all under John Brennan of the CIA, and they all lied through their teeth. Maybe this guy was so naive that he thought he wasn't lying. But nevertheless, there he is. Okay, so why? How did they get away with this? Well, these are the same people or the heirs to the same people. I mean, John Brennan, head of the CIA, was handpicked by George Tenet. Okay. Now, George Tenet was CIA director who bowed to Dick Cheney and said, oh, yeah, there are a bunch of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We know they're there. And besides, there are ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, sotto voce. In other words, Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Both of those were all made up out of whole cloth, but Cheney wanted that story told. And so an estimate dated October 1, 2022, which I call the Whore of Babylon. I think they gave it a different title, okay? 4 national intelligence directors were responsible for putting that thing together. It was wrong on all counts and used as the basis for Colin Powell's presentation, so to speak, presentation of lies before the UN Security Council on February 5th, 2003. Okay. And what happened to those people? They got bonuses. Some of them got promoted. So, in other words, 1 million Iraqis dead based on spurious, tainted evidence. Now, don't take my word for it. The head of the Senate Intelligence Committee in 2008, after a 5-year study, said the evidence is used to justify Iraq was unconfirmed, contradicted, or even non-existent, period, end quote. Take those words to the bank. Okay, I ask you, what does non-existent intelligence look like? This is the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was a bipartisan report. Check it out, June something, 2008. Okay, well, intelligence that doesn't exist, well, they make it up. So the reason this can happen is because no one is held accountable. So why do I say all this? This time, there's a major intelligence director who is trying to make people accountable, including the president of the United States, for God's sake, okay? Tulsi Gabbard is her name. I know her. I briefed her when she was a representative. She's smarter than hell. She asks the right questions. I don't agree with everything she's done, but she's thrown down the gauntlet to the deep state, for God's sake. Whoa! And now she has to, so to speak, run the gauntlet between the legacy press, mainstream media, and the deep state, personified by these people who are shown now in documents who have made this whole thing up. So this is new. Can she succeed? The odds are against her. And, unless the major media decides, well, maybe we ought to tell the truth for once, or maybe we ought to confess that, we didn't get it all right. That doesn't seem likely to me. So all I'm saying here is that Tulsi Gabbard, I admire her greatly for doing this. People need to realize that she's skating on thin ice. Now, she has not only the work of the people who put out these documents over the last week or so, she has our work. Veteran intelligence professionals for sanity has, as I said before, followed this like a junkyard dog. We've looked at the implications of the technical matters having to do with the non-existent Russian hack. And we've also talked about President Obama's personal involvement in this. Now, it's interesting that Tulsi Gabbard and the documents are talking about Obama as being the prime mover and guilty, but they haven't really adduced a lot of evidence of that before the election. After the election, he had them do this meretricious intelligence community assessment. But before the election, I think this is really important for people to know. I went back into my records. It was kind of a trip down memory lane. But back in, June 2022, I told a story about FBI emails that had been released in connection with the trial of a fellow named Sussman a a Democratic National Committee lawyer who is clearly lied to the FBI, but was acquitted by a DC jury. Anyhow, these emails show that Obama was actively encouraging his top security officials to go ahead and come up with this faux charge of hacking by Russia. The newly available emails I wrote show that the Bureau, that is FBI, was still insisting or requesting on October 13, please give us the forensic results. CrowdStrike, you did the forensics, please. Remember, we're being under pressure to produce. That was October 13th, 2016. Obama didn't want to wait for that. Hell, the election is coming up on November 9th. So what does the record show? The records show that Obama handpicked James Clapper, who is famous for saying, the Russians are Russians, they're almost genetically inclined to do evil, to do the blah, 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 blah. Almost genetic. Wow. Okay. So they picked Clapper, and then they picked a fellow named Jay Johnson. Now, why did he pick Jay Johnson? Well, he's a lawyer, and he sort of already had taken liberties with the law and telling Obama, yeah, okay, you can kill by drone strike. You can kill this person, that person with very little evidence. Oh, even American citizens, that's okay too. Jay Johnson's married to a Catholic woman, okay? He said, I'm so glad I didn't convert to Catholicism because then I have to go to confession. And the kinds of things I did, well, prefer not to. Anyhow, Jay Johnson and James Clapper were asked by Obama before the forensics were in, look, you do that memorandum, you tell them the Russians hack to help, are hacking to help Trump against Hillary. So this is what the memo said. October 7th, 2016. The U.S. intelligence community is confident the Russian government directed the recent compromise of emails of U.S. persons and so forth. These thefts and disclosures were intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. And Jay Johnson explained to Congress, to the House Intelligence Committee, quote, the president approved the statement of October 7th. I know he wanted to make the statement so that he was very definitely a statement by the U.S. government, not just Clapper, not just me, it was the U.S. government, okay? Now, the big thing here is, of course, that Obama knew that the election was coming up. He didn't want to wait for the forensics because the forensics are not likely to be all that good, okay? So he said, look, you two guys, not the FBI, the CIA, we'll do those later. You two guys put out this thing on hacking exactly 1 month, or 1 month and 2 days before the election. Now, why do I say all this? It's because the Democrats and the administration were really having trouble selling this yarn about Russian hacking into the DNC. So what happened next? Well, I was at a Democratic think tank, the old John Podesta think tank. Anyhow, I was there in April 2017, and Jennifer Palmieri, who was Hillary's PR person during the campaign, she explained what had happened. She explained that the Democrats decided when the Democratic National Convention occurred and WikiLeaks released those documents, that the smart thing was to blame it on the Russians, blame the release on the Russians. And that way they would divert attention from the content in the emails, which showed, in effect, that Hillary had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders earlier that year. Okay, so it was a diversion, and then let's get the Russians and make sure that the Russians are associated with Trump. So that's what Palmieri indicated was decided at the convention. And then she said she was in her golf cart going around to various outlets and cable outlets and trying to sell this story. And no one would believe it. No one would. Really hard, she says. I was there. I listened to really hard selling that story. But then when we got back to Brooklyn, Brooklyn was Hillary's campaign board headquarters. Then things seemed to start to happen. In August and September, uh, correspondents, journalists who had really good relations with intelligence started to tell us details about this, and some intelligence people, but still, we needed a public statement. We needed something definitive, and the election was coming. And guess what? I quote Jennifer Palmieri. Finally, we got to the point. On October 7th, when the administration came out with a very stunning memorandum, how stunning it was for both the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of Homeland Security to put out a statement, a long statement, that said with high confidence that Russia was interfering with the election and that they were also directing the timing of the hacks, of the leaks. And it named the institutions, WikiLeaks and so forth, as being Russian led, and how stunning it was to be that certain and that public. So I do think, says Jennifer Palmieri here in April of 2017, so I do think that the answer for the Democrats now in both the House and the Senate is to talk more about it, talk about it more and make it more real. So you have to go to these. When I lived in Washington, I was a plague to these people because I always try to ask the first question. So all I'm saying here is that Obama not only was the architect of this thing, he prevailed on two very flexible leaders, Jay Johnson and James Clapper, to put out this thing a month before the election. And then after the election, oh my God, what happened? Hillary lost anyway, right? And then they had to cover their tracks. It was then that Obama appointed CIA, NSA, and the FBI to come up with this, quote, intelligence community memorandum, which certified the hacking, certified the interference without any evidence at all. And now that whole story is being told by these emails where honest CIA officials are saying, well, yeah, wait a second. This person close to Putin said Putin couldn't care less who wins. He can work with either one, and he has no preference. And John Brennan turned that on its head, and he said, no, here's one clause from one thing I just found, not available to everybody. Oh yeah, there's a real preference for Trump, and that's why sotto voce. That's why Hillary lost. So now we're getting to the bottom of that thing. All I can say is that Tulsi has bit off a whole bunch, and if it were necessary, or maybe I just mentioned this, when Obama, well, before Obama left office, January 2, 2017, now President-elect Trump is waiting to take office. What happens? Well, Chuck Schumer, the head of the Senate, calls up Rachel Maddow and says, Rachel, I get to see you. I have some dynamite information. So Rachel, oh, come on, Chuck. And so Chuck comes in that night and she says, oh, so this is on air, of course. She says, now, Chuck, what is it you have? He says, oh, well, I thought that Trump was a pretty smart person, but he's done a really stupid thing. Oh, what would that be, Chuck? He's taken on the intelligence community. And they have 6 ways to Sunday to get back at you. It's a very, very, very dangerous thing to do. Oh, wow. Thanks, Chuck. What Rachel should have said, of course, was, do you mean, do you mean, Senator Schumer, that the president-elect should be very afraid of the intelligence community? It's clearly the message, right? Well, what happened next, of course, that was the 2nd of January. On the 5th of January 2017, Obama met with Brennan, Comey, the NSA guy, and just a couple other aides and said, all right, now we're going to surface that intelligence community assessment, which says the Russians did their best to help Trump win, and they're largely responsible for Hillary losing. That's published tomorrow. So tomorrow, you go down and brief the president-elect because we don't want him to be blindsided on this, right? So he appoints Clapper and Brennan and Comey to go down and brief to New York to brief Trump. So they go in there and they tell him, now, Mr. Trump, this is a little awkward, but just today, actually, is published an intelligence community assessment saying that the Russians really helped you win the election. So we just didn't want you to be blindsided. It's already published today. It'll be on the wire. And then Comey, by prearrangement with Obama, says, now, will you other two gentlemen please leave because I have something very sensitive to say to the president-elect. Oh, sure. Now, here's Comey. Mr. President-elect, I don't know, this is very awkward for me, but there's this scurrilous report going around in the press. It's about you ostensibly cavorting with prostitutes in Moscow, and it's just explicit and it's awful, and it's not confirmed, but that too is coming out today, and it's in the press, and we just wanted to, I just let you know so that you know, okay? Now, Glenn, you had a real estate guy from New York City with little experience in Washington. If it were I or Bill Binney or anyone else, we would have said, thank you very much, Director Comey. Please go back and clean out your desk. You're out of here. We know that trick. Give me a break. Give me a break. You're out of here. That's a trick pulled on everybody. Just so you know, prostitutes in Moscow, get out of here, Comey, and don't darken my doorstep again. Instead, Trump, convinced of his persuasive powers and his magnetic personality, spends the next 2 months trying to get Comey on his side. Comey, leader, together with Brennan, of the deep state, which pretty much emasculated him for his first 4 years. So what now? People who were there at the time, Kash Patel, now head of the FBI, and others who were there knew what was going. Devin Nunes, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, is now head of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So they have the documents. The documents are out there. Will the major press be able to suppress them or to ostensibly refute them? They'll try. It's up to us, Glenn, and that's why I appreciate this opportunity to say all this. It's up to us to make sure that doesn't happen, but we're up against it because the mainstream media is what it is, and there's so many deep equities involved here, including the president himself, President Obama, who, if you take an honest look at the documents and what he did well before the election, namely causing that thing on October 7th, 2016, that said the Russians hacked. They had no evidence. They didn't have a report from the forensics unit that was supposed to find the evidence. Obama told them, go ahead anyway. And Johnson later said, well, the president wanted us to do it, so Well, it was the presidents of the government, not just me, and not just Clapper. Give me a break. These are the kinds of people we had at the higher reaches of our government at that time.
It's, it's really strange that yeah, all of this happened without any any significant pushback. But now that a lot of this is coming out, it can't really be refuted. It also looks as if Tulsi Gabbard is pushing very hard, especially against Obama, for some accountability. Just as a last question here, do you think something positive can come out of this if we start to clean up the Russiagate issue? Do you think it's possible to at least turn the tide a little bit to restore some reason, at least reassess some of our blind hatred towards Russia and the Russians? And, this would be important to normalize the idea that you can at least discuss the security concerns of your opponents.
That's the $64 question, Glenn. Uh, Much hangs on the answer to this. I mentioned Iraq. No one was held responsible. Uh, I had the notion that the CIA should be disbanded, that an independent group of researchers should serve as CIA analysts, and all the covert action people that overthrow governments be put under the Pentagon where they belong. Uh, and then I thought, well, no, even the assessment board, even the analysts have been so corrupted. Uh, Abolish the whole thing. But I thought, well, maybe that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, the bathwater is very, very deep and gets all the funding and everything, but still, the CIA and the intelligence community analysts held to the truth that Iran was not working on a nuclear weapon, that they had stopped working on it at the end of 2003 and had not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. That's not have to do with enrichment. I mean, it's a weapon, okay? That was big. And Tulsi Gabbard, to her credit, this past March, reiterated that, which has been reiterated every year. Now it's a different horse, a horse of a different color, because we no longer have the IAEA in those sites. But I was saying, wow, there are some honest analysts left in the intelligence community and specifically in the CIA. Now I'm heartened to know that there were analysts in the CIA. They all made their case to say this was stupid, this was unwarranted. There was no evidence of any preference by Mr. Putin for Trump. That contrary to that, there was lots of evidence that number one, he didn't give a rat's patootie, or number two, he actually preferred Hillary Clinton, devil you know being better than the devil you don't know. There's evidence. So my bottom line, hey, there's still some honest people doing the analysis in the CIA. My regret, not one of them. Not one of them had the guts to quit, go to the press, whistleblow, and say, look, you guys, this is what's going on. And that can be forgiven, because to whom would they go? What kind of sort of the press would honestly tell their story, for God's sake? So unless the truth gets out, and the truth is now available in documents. Did I mention my Uber driver yesterday? Okay, well, I tell
No.
him about this because I find out that he had worked as an assistant in Congress for about 10 years. Okay. I say, hey, did you hear about the documents on Russiagate that Tulsi Gabbard has released? I say, oh, I read about that. What'd you think? Well, I also saw on TV last night that there's lots of counter things to that these were all, just the Trump sort of thing. And yeah, so I said, well, what want to know which to believe? It's, yeah, look at the documents, for God's sake, look at the documents. Now, How many people are going to look at the documents? One of my brothers emailed me today. Said, how do I find the documents? Well, you go to Office of National Intelligence, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the website there's got the documents. So yeah, it's not what everybody wants to do, but do it for God's sake. And then you'll see that the proof there is in the pudding. We got to get this message out because if Tulsi Gabbard does not succeed in bringing people to account, you know, do I want Trump? Sorry, do I want Comey and Brennan in jail? Doesn't matter. I want them held to account. Okay, and if they're not held to account, then we have Iraq 2, where people are not held to account for prostituting the process of intelligence. And I use that term explicitly. It's not what we used to do. And I do have some hope with these honest people who are now been revealed to have wanted to tell the right story, plus the ones that stuck by the business about Iran not working on a nuclear weapon. So there's a kernel of honesty. I just hope that the outcome of this whole thing, Glenn, is that people are exposed for what they did, and that the next group is not going to be tempted to do the same thing, and because they feel so exempt or so immune from being held to account.
Well, hopefully that will be progress, and this is why you would have that's why you want transparency. That's why you want to let in the daylight and yeah, hold up people accountable. At least, yeah, something can be learned from this. But the last 10 years has made me very pessimistic about the ability to learn from our mistakes. Anyways, Ray, I've already taken too much of your time, so thank you so much for sharing your ideas and also for the past 10 years actually pushing back against media narrative, which of course comes at a social cost as well, which you knew were a narrative which you knew were false. So thanks again that at least some good people are standing up, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you very much.